Hello everybody, I am Javier Fernandez-Ruiz. I am here today to present you my last paper, Assessment Design Decisions in Practice, Profile Identification in Approaches to Assessment Design. This study was developed by our team, Early Research Group, and counted with the precious help of Ernesto Panadero, Daniel García Pérez, and Leire Pinedo. But let's start. It is really important to understand how university teachers design assessment. I will argue that yes, it is. And it is because we know that specific assessment practices, if done properly, can have beneficial effects for students on aspects such as self-regulation, motivation, and learning. In an ideal world, university teachers will be carrying out assessment practices aligned with all that empirical knowledge. But they aren't, at least not all of them, not even most of them. In the latest research, we can still observe a traditional assessment panorama in European universities. And it is not because teachers are not trying to improve. They spend 1/3 of their time designing and promoting assessment activities. But they, maybe due to a lack of understanding of assessment techniques, do not end up obtaining benefits in relation to teaching and learning. That is why it's necessary to investigate the way that teachers design their assessment practices, to identify challenging areas that may be stopping them from achieving a set of assessment practices they feel comfortable with. And what is known about that? This is not a new research topic. David Carles argued in 2015 that assessment design is one of the most critical aspects of assessment practices. And since then, we have learned that assessment design is also an extremely complex phenomenon. Many contextual and personal factors play an important role on assessment design. There is also studied what kind of design actions the teachers perform when they design their assessment methods. Berman and collaborators categorized 3 different actions: essential design actions, selective actions, and meta-design actions. The aim of this study is pretty similar, to investigate the way in which university teachers design their assessment practices. But there's a twist. Instead of using self-report methods, we asked them to do it in front of us. We started from 3 research questions. Are there different teacher assessment design profiles? Are there differential characteristics in the teachers belonging to each of the profiles? And what are the differences between the assessment practices designed during the assignment and the assessment practices implemented in their subject? The participants were 17 teachers from 3 academic disciplines and 4 universities. You can see the demographic data in the table. We contacted them by email, and we held an individual session which included an initial interview and a simulation task. During the initial interview, we asked participants about contextual factors such as teaching experience and training, and about the development of their assessment practices over the years. Once the interview was completed, each teacher was given a set of learning outcomes, taken from the syllabus of their actual subjects to ensure that they were familiar with them. Then, we asked them to design an assessment methodology to assess, quotation mark, in the best way possible these learning outcomes. A think-aloud protocol was followed, and the participants were instructed to make explicit all the ideas and thoughts they had during the process. For the first 2 research questions, we followed an open coding process with 2 researchers independently coding each transcription. For the 3rd research question, we followed a closed coding process using the categorization by Berman et al. Teachers performed 8 different actions during the task. You can see them described in the table. Every action may have been carried out by the teacher once or more times during the task, and each time it will be coded independently. The presence or absence of the actions and the order in which they are carried out were used to find possible profiles among the participants. After the content analysis of the teacher's actions, 3 different profiles were seen in the design of the assessment practices. We call these profiles classic, competence, and cohesive profiles. 7 teachers were categorized in the classic profile, and they designed a total of 25 evidences. This profile is pretty straightforward. They tend to choose directly the assessment evidences they consider the most convenient, and then most of the teachers went on to give them a percentage of the grade without further consideration. Only in few cases, they stopped to reflect on how their methods would align with learning outcomes, how to promote students' participation, or which would be the best way of providing feedback. 5 teachers were categorized as competence profile. The most common pattern on this type of teacher was to take a close look at the learning outcomes of the subject, reflect on the best way to elicit them in an assessment task, and only then design the assessment task and explain how they would grade it. However, in this profile, it was also relatively common to make a pause to consider the use of rubrics. And lastly, 4 teachers were categorized as cohesive, designing a total of 10 assessment evidences. Teachers in this profile followed a different path. Normally, they tended to think first of the teaching methods that they will implement in their subject, after which the chosen assessment practices were a logical consequence. Are there differential characteristics in the teachers belonging to each one of the profiles? This was our second research question. We looked for difference in academic discipline, teaching experience, teaching training, conceptions and practices. There were not appreciable differences in discipline. However, as you can see in the table, there were visible differences in experience and training. The teachers categorized in the competence profile seemed to be those who had less experience both in teaching in higher education and teaching in their current subjects, but they were also the ones who did more teacher training courses despite being the less experienced. Teachers in the 3 profiles show different trends in the way they have developed their assessment practices over time. When we asked them why they had opted for the methods they currently use in their subjects, the teachers of the classic profile did not offer a clear explanation, and their answers indicated a certain inertia with respect to the tradition in their department or their faculty. Over the years, they have tried to give greater weight to continuous assessment, but without modifying the set of instruments they had established. The teachers of the competence profile generally declared that their assessment practices were designed with the aim of preparing the students for their professional future, trying to give them a practical and competence approach. However, they stated that they were limited by the time that formative and continuous assessment requires. The teachers of the cohesive profile were, once again, pretty straightforward. They declared that the assessment of their subjects had been a logical result of their teaching methods or the characteristics of the subject. Our last research question explored the differences between the assessment practices designed during the task and the assessment practices implemented in their subjects. Given that the set of contents and learning outcomes to be assessed during the task was the same that the teachers must assess in their subjects, similarities and differences between the assessment practices designed during the task and those of their subjects were analyzed. And 10 teachers implemented changes in their assessment practices during the task. According to the categorization of Berman et al., 7 teachers carried out essential design activities, and 3 teachers carried out selective design activities. When asked about the reasons for those differences, most of their answers indicated that implementing these methods in real practice will be excessively difficult for several reasons. Among them will be the workload that it will entail for them or for their students, logistical or coordination difficulty, and the ratio of students to teachers. Interestingly, 2 teachers stated that the only reason they have for not implementing these methods in the real subject is because they just had not thought about it. These are our findings. To summarize, this study presents 3 different profiles regarding assessment design, which have been called classic, competence, and cohesive. Each profile has differential characteristics in their approach to assessment design, and this has implications for professional practice. It is noteworthy that most of the teachers designed different assessment practices compared with the ones they are using in their subjects, even though the aim was to assess the same set of learning outcomes. The main reason for that refers to the lack of resources or the workload that it would imply, both for their students and themselves. This represents another example of how teachers' intentions and practices can be really far away from each other. The discrepancies between intentions and practice go back a long way. Previous literature already showed that even if teachers are aware of the formative purposes of assessment and agree with them, they are usually not capable of putting them into practice. Most of the participants recognize that their assessment practices are not ideal, but rather an approximation that is achievable through the available resources. The definition of resources also varied among the participants in this study, depending on their profile. Classic profile teachers seem to lack the knowledge and ability to make meaningful innovations to their assessment practices, and they tended to use assessment practices governed with the tradition in the department. Competence profile teachers might have had the knowledge, as they were usually well trained regarding teaching and assessment. However, even if they considered themselves capable of designing an effective set of assessment practices, they claim to be unable to balance them and make them efficient in terms of workload and coordination. Both challenges are relatively well known. Based on previous theory and research, we offer a series of recommendations for institutions and teachers that aim to help them face the challenges. In the country where our study is based, which is Spain, pre-service pedagogical training is not compulsory for higher education teachers. This results in many teachers starting their assessment design processes without any theoretical knowledge about how assessment may be done. This makes it especially important to offer high-quality in-service training to provide them with the empirical and practical tools to improve their assessment practices. Chu and Brown carried out a systematic review on assessment literacy, concluding that teacher education must address 4 pertinent issues to be effective for teachers. First, teachers must have a solid assessment literacy knowledge base, implying that teachers' education programs must include assessment courses as part of their curriculum. Second, assessment education needs to be long enough to let teachers acquire a deep understanding about assessment. It also needs to establish connection between assessment theory and practice. Third, it needs to address teachers as individuals and professionals. Every teacher has a background of conceptions, expectations, and prior experience about assessment. And lastly, teacher educations need to understand that assessment literacy development is not merely an accumulation of assessment knowledge, but rather the development of a sophisticated, contextually appropriate set of interrelated competencies. This is a big issue. Most of our participants mentioned the lack of time to put in practice their preferred assessment methods. Efficiency in formative assessment has been an underexplored topic in the literature, but authors such as Higgins et al. Provide useful strategies for carrying out high-quality assessment methods without compromising the time available to the teacher. These strategies are as follows. The assessment workload can be reduced by avoiding repetition. Continuous assessment is a requirement in many European universities, but there are methods to minimize the total number of products assessed. These methods could include accepting students for a final assessment based on coursework performance. Using automatically assessed virtual tools is a way to obtain general knowledge of your students' progress without having to read and assess individual tasks. It can mean less workload for the teachers while different skills are developed by the students. It can include possible periodic tests, assessing each other and gaining exceptions from the final examination. Additionally, oral informal feedback given during in-class activities can be easily combined with the use of technology and is especially useful in large classes. Its impact on learning and self-regulation is one of the main lines of educational research currently, and it is also combined with all of the previous categories. Apart from a method to reduce teacher workload, its use can be enormously beneficial for students if it's implemented correctly. We present a new approach to investigate how university teachers design their assessment methods. We found 3 different design patterns: classic, which focuses on the feasibility of the assessment tasks; competence, which focuses on the alignment with the learning outcomes; and cohesive, which focuses on the alignment with their teaching methods. It is striking that most of our participants carried out a design focused only on one of the 3 elements. Interestingly, the assessment practices that the participants designed in the simulation task were different from the ones they used in the real lectures. When asked about this point, participants explained these differences because they lacked the resources needed to implement these complex practices. This study represents a starting point for practice-based research involving assessment in higher education. Our results make explicit the need to answer further questions to fully understand how higher education teachers can be helped to link their assessment practices with the vast empirical knowledge about assessment. And that will be it. Thank you very much, and see you in the live discussion. Bye.